All right, Facebook. See, I'm running around. The kids are getting ready for bed. My wife is at a play, and I'm on dad detail, making sure they're fed, they're showered, and they're in bed. And I'm running up and down the steps to make sure we hit that 8 o'clock time frame, because this show, the Dependent Independent podcast, Dependent Independent production, live Facebook live stream that posts and goes live 8 o'clock Eastern Standard Time and 5 o'clock Pacific Standard Time every Wednesday. This is our third episode in the series. My name's Nick Goblish. I am a podcast producer, a podcast host, podcast creator, and a YouTube live streamer, Facebook live streamer. And I'm here to bring you the tips and tricks to make your podcasting easier. And we're definitely going to talk about what happens today, or what happens when you decide to, man, I'm really out of breath. Oh, man. This is Facebook Live, guys. This is what it is. Can't be more authentic than this. Whew. Because then we got bedtime right after this. So for the next 15 to 20 minutes, I'm going to bring you tips and tricks to make podcasting easier. Like I was saying before I caught my breath, that today we're going to talk about the imperfection of your first podcast. I remember when I did my first podcast back in 2015. It posted in January of 2015, but I had listened to podcasts for a really long period of time, probably about 7 years on my iPod Touch, like Generation 2. I had long commutes. You got it, Liam. Long commutes. And we're doing this Facebook Live, so you guys are more than welcome to chime in. I'll post what I can and bring it up. Uh-oh, whoops. My friend Liam, let's see if I can do this. Boop, says I'm making him thirsty, but that's how I roll. Man, it's hot. I don't know what it is. Like today it was super hot outside, so the house got hot, and we should be running the air and all that stuff. So, but I remember when I decided to launch my podcast back in October 2014, it was a daunting task. It was scary. It was my first opportunity to create. I'd studied art in school and studied radio and video, and I hadn't done any audio production. I did video production for an entrepreneur friend of mine, but I hadn't done any audio. But I knew I was able to do it. I knew I was capable of doing it. But what I really was scared of is the fear of putting myself out there. And because once you put it out there, you can't take it back. But because of the time I spent studying the quality of audio, the quality of video, in my head, all I wanted to do was make sure that it was perfect. It needed to be perfect. And I realized that that is impossible. So if you talk to any podcast, I've been attending the Mid-Atlantic Podcast Conference for the last 2 years, and I spoke about this last year, about the idea that anytime you do a podcast, for those aspiring podcasters, or if you're a solopreneur or a business owner that wants to use podcasting to increase your brand awareness, there is a probably 100% chance that your first podcast will be your worst podcast. It's the one time where you try to figure out, do I have the right microphones? I rarely listen to my shows. I produce the Dependent Independent podcast, so it's a 200-episode podcast. And I like the fact that I record all these shows. We used to do half shows in between, so I have about 145 actually recorded shows on iTunes. And we talked about it in our first podcast. You can go to your podcast app on iOS or Android and make sure you subscribe. And I believe the link is in the show notes to this video once it hits YouTube. The idea of doing your first podcast, and you want it to be perfect, the moment you put it out there, and the fact that I don't listen to my shows, I've kind of forgot exactly what my show sounded like, but for a couple giggles, I decided to listen to it back. We recorded the show in my friend's office, not quite like this studio, and we recorded it on a USB mic. Now, see, the mics, we're not going to talk about mics today, but these mics are directly hooked up via XLR cables, a little bit different than a USB cable, right into a recorder. I really don't like recording my audio directly into my computer. I think computers are funny and weird, even though we live stream this directly through my computer. I don't believe audio really meets its full potential if it's zipped through a motherboard and a soundboard. So I record everything through my external recorder, but back then I was recording through a USB mic, and I didn't even have editing equipment. I didn't even know, or applications or software. I had no idea how best to record my audio. So I was actually recording my first episode, podcast number 1, episode 1. We recorded it through a video editing software. It wasn't even through an audio editing software. And the first episode, technically my first episode, was my second episode. That's one actually luxury I had. Even though I put my first episode out there, it was actually our second episode because we recorded a show. It was horribly recorded. There was a sound like this going through the video. I'm tapping the microphone right now. And once we listened to it back, I got my co-host, my pal Dewey, to actually re-record the show. And it's amazing how we're actually able to do it and still sound like a normal conversation. What I'm getting at is you're going to decide to do a podcast. You're going to decide that you say to yourself, you know what? I am made to do this. I have premium content. I know who my audience is. They're going to want to listen. And all I have to do is speak on a microphone, and they will. But because you're figuring it out just like I did, you're going to go through your bumps and bruises of your first episode, and it's going to be probably the worst episode you ever do. Now, don't get me wrong. There's people out there that are much smarter than me and technically sound more sound than I am, that you could probably record your first show, and it'll sound awesome. Awesome to you. That's great. I'm so glad you figured it out. If you know better than me, definitely find me on Instagram or Twitter at dependent_Nick, or direct message me through Facebook and tell me what your secrets are. But my first episode trying to figure out, even though I had all that editing background and audio and video training in college, I still needed to figure it out. Now, back then, even though I posted my episode 1, there's one thing I didn't realize that actually existed. What existed was this thing called episode 0. Here, we got 3 comments here. I'm going to post this here from my buddy Lou. He's right. Perfection is not possible. It's absolutely right. There's this thing called episode 0. Now, at first when I heard that, I didn't quite know what it was. So I did some research, and I found out that episode 0 is the best way to introduce your podcast in the shortest time frame possible, kind of give your audience a tickle of what you want to produce. It probably takes minimal time, the least amount of pressure, but allows you to do a couple things. So episode 0 is a 3 to 4 minute, could be 5 minute, no more than that, initial podcast that you put on iTunes. We talked about in the last video that we did about podcast hosts. So rather than putting a full episode of full content, you basically want to wet the whistle of your potential audience. And it's a quick taste, almost like a commercial of what your podcast is going to be. So I recommend, rather than putting out a whole podcast, putting all that pressure that I did, because again, but also realizing that it's probably not going to be the best material you can do, if you can produce. If I listen to my first episode and listen to my last podcast, I could tell you that I've gotten very good leaps and bounds from what I've done before, but I had to start somewhere. Now, again, this show and everything we provide here is about making podcasting easier, and what makes it hard is just the idea that you think it could be perfect. But it won't be. It takes a lot of practice, a lot of time, a lot of energy and effort to come down to a basement or record out of your living room or wherever you have a microphone and a recorder to record your message, your content to your audience, your desired audience, or to produce or to promote your business. So episode 0 should have 4 things. Let me see if I get these right. 4 things. 1, you should be very clear on who you are. Just like I started the show, I told you my name is Nick Goblish and what I do. So anyone tuning to this show right in the beginning knows who I am, or you're watching this live on my Facebook channel or our Facebook page, or you're also watching this on our YouTube channel at the Dependent Independent Podcast channel on YouTube. So you want to let everyone know who you are. And we're probably going to talk in future episodes about how to use your voice and how to really use your affect of your voice to draw in your audience. You don't want to be monotone. Hi, my name is Nick Goblish. That's not the way to do it. If I were you, and I was tuning into that, I would probably tune out right away. So 1, you want to be clear to your audience about who you are. 2, you want to tell your audience what you're talking about. What is the show about? Whether it be you're doing a podcast about baking, a podcast about fishing, like my friend Clay Groves at fishnerds.com. Whatever your intent is or your content, make sure you're very, very clear who you are, what you're doing, and also it's really great to let everyone why you're doing it. What's the message? What's the intent of your show? What do you want people to take away from? And that's very, very important. I want to be very open and transparent with my audience about why I do this. I mean, it's great. It can be entertaining, but there's a purpose to this. There's a purpose why I do this all the time. There's a purpose why I put the effort into this and why I want to help you make your podcasting easier. So those 3 things, make sure you tell the audience who you are. Be very clear. And it's funny, when I first did my podcast, I was so afraid. I don't know why, by putting myself out there, that I needed to keep anonymity. So on all my shows, I call myself Nick G, but I can, the jury's out. I actually have, or the secret's out. I'm Nick Goldbush, and you're watching this on my Facebook page. So it's actually me. So tell them who you are. Make sure you let them know what your show is and what it's about. Make sure you're clear on why you're doing it. What's your intent? What do you want them to take away? What will they get out of the show? And lastly, the 4th thing is a call to action. Call to action, you see it all the time on social media. You see people click here, subscribe here, tune in here, all these types of things. Those are call to action, or call to CTAs. I saw someone abbreviate it in an article I was reading. So your call to action in your episode 0 could be basically, okay, you found this show, and again, promote the heck out of it on all your social media sites. Links, we'll talk about how to do that, but I'm sure if you're cognizant of social media, you know how to do that. You take the link from your podcast feed, or you take it from iTunes and embed it in your Facebook page, your Twitter, your Instagram, your Pinterest, wherever you want to promote it, so people find it. I found a way to promote my show when I first started by putting it on my Facebook page, and a lot of people in the community who knew who I was because I posted things on Facebook now were able to listen to me. But remember, my first show was a whole half hour. If I'd done episode 0, I could have put all that into one 3 to 4 minute clip. Now, the irony is, when I did my show, I didn't know what it was going to be, but I'm sure you do because you've thought it long and hard about how to what you wanted to do to produce a podcast. You've done all the research. You've got it on a host. You know what your show's about. You know who you are. You know what the intent is and why you're doing it, what you want them to take away. And then you give them a call to action at the end, which basically says to your subscribers, listen, I need you to subscribe. I need you to check us out on Twitter, on Instagram, Facebook, whatever it is. So once you get people to start doing that, and I think people really want to be told what to do. That's the whole call to action thing. I mean, it's amazing when you just tell people what to do and they do it. So that call to action will drive people to subscribe to your show. So when you are ready and you've gotten the kinks out and you've recorded your show, gone through the editing, made sure it's the best you could possibly put out, you then post that on your podcast host. It's fed into iTunes and any podcast app on iOS or Android. We talked about that in our first episode. You should check that out. Was our first episode? Yeah, on the apps you can use. And then the hosts on our second episode, which is on YouTube, and you can check it on our feed. And they will subscribe. So the moment, yeah, I agree with you, and I'll put that up there too. Why does it do that? There you go. Yeah, Lou, you're absolutely right. I don't know why I didn't think that either. I don't think they even called that 3 years ago, episode 0. But it would have been great. I wouldn't have put so much pressure on myself to actually, when you're putting a half an hour, we did, again, in a half an hour, we failed, epic fail, and then put another one. So we have this lost episode. But if I had done that 4-minute episode and really thought long and hard and made it as precise as possible, I probably would have got more people to tune in episode 1 rather than now they listen to our most recent shows and then go back to episode 1. It's a great way to build momentum, and especially when you give that call to action and they subscribe, they can immediately subscribe to it and it'll hit their podcast feed the moment you put it out there, whether it be on your schedule Tuesdays, Wednesdays, Thursdays, Saturdays, wherever you want to do it. So I hope that was helpful. I hope after listening or watching this video, you get a better understanding about that your first episode, it's going to be imperfect. It's never going to be the way you want it to, and that's okay, but you have to get your first episode out. It is essential. I did it. I got through it. I look back and laugh at it. It's amazing how far I've come from the audio quality, the microphones we use to what we use now. But man, if I had known about episode 0, I would have taken the time to put that 3 to 4 minute video or audio. I keep saying video. It's so confusing. That podcast out there that would have given my audience just a taste, would have promoted the heck out of it, and that way they would have subscribed and immediately got my first episode. I want to thank you for tuning in. I want to thank Liam and Lou for tuning in. Again, these shows post, or we do live streams on Wednesdays at 8 Eastern Time, 5 Pacific Time. And just to let you know, yes, call to action is key. You're absolutely right. So, actually, you know what? Just to let you know, I'm balancing as we do this, and not only am I helping to make your podcasting easier, My whole goal, and I've learned how to do this because I balance a life around all this stuff. I don't have all day to plan to do these things. I do this at the time when my kids are asleep, or my kids are busy and my wife's asleep, or everyone's asleep and I'm down here doing this. I'm so happy that I have the opportunity to block out some time in my busy schedule to be able to talk to you about all this stuff. And the goal is to make it easier for you. But I'm also a dancing dad. If you listen to my show, my daughter dances, competitively dances. Is that right? Competitive dancer. And soon enough, they're going to have the recital in June, and I have to start practicing as a dancing dad. So those practices, I found out today, start Wednesday. So these shows in the future, now that I cut myself off, will either happen on Tuesdays or Thursdays. I haven't decided, but make sure you check and follow my Facebook, my personal Facebook feed, and you'll see the notification in there about when that show is going to post, and I'll share it on the podcast co-host group, the podcast page, and the dependent independent production page. Got so much stuff going on. It's crazy how much stuff I have going on. Again, thanks guys for tuning in. Thanks for checking this out. Tune in next week. We're going to talk about tips and tricks on how to make podcasting easier. I'm Nick Goblish, podcast producer, podcast creator, and a guy who's here to help you. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you guys next week.